Can you all hear me, or do I need the mic? Hear me in the back? What did I just say? This is Matt Regan. He's our Senior Vice President for Housing. Matt asked me if I would say a few words to open up the discussion today. My name is Jim Wonderman. I'm the President and CEO of the Bay Area Council, and we're here to talk about our favorite subject, which is housing. If you're not, it's like being on the airplane. If any of you are not here to talk about housing, get off the plane now, go to the bar down the street, or do something else. So, how many of you have been to the Bay Area Council before? Been over here before? So some of you have. Why don't we go around? Mark, why don't we just quickly name and affiliation, go around the room so you get the
Mark
breath.
Bruce with Napa County. I'm also on the MTC and Immediate Past President of ABank.
Catherine Strayham, I have a consulting firm, as public affairs consultant. I'm also in the planning commission for viewing the rules.
And former Bay Area Council staff member and head of transportation once a few years.
Sarah Seeloff, I'm the Executive Director of the nonprofit Center for Creative Land Recycling, and we help communities create infill, including affordable housing, on brownfields and other vacant land.
Go across.
Mark Northcross, and Chief Advisor, Financial Advisor in California Cities.
Our chair.
Just looking at my chair. Denise Hingston with TMG Partners. I'm the chair of the Housing Committee with Kofi Bonner. And in addition to developing housing, I'm on the Zoning Adjustments Board in East Bay, so I get the honor of approving and refining. Hopefully we'll do more of that.
Hi, I'm Tim Cole, and I'm Executive Director of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. We're an advocacy group here in the city.
Corey Smith, Community Organizer with the Housing Action Coalition.
Rochelle Trigueros, Bay Area Council.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm a reporter with the news organization The Registry.
I'm Alma Kayo. I'm a local college teacher, and I have a few clients who are interested in developing housing for young community college instructors, and so I'm here for ideas.
I have a couple.
I'm Cynthia Kroll. I'm the Chief Economist of the Association of Bay Area Governments.
Hello, Andrew Sabie with the law firm of Cox Castle Nicholson. I'm a land use lawyer and also here in my capacity as the this year's chair of the East Bay Leadership Council.
Hi, Pilar Lorenzana Campbell. I'm the policy director for SV at Home. We advocate for affordable housing in Santa Clara County.
Hello, Melissa Jones with Bar High. We're the coalition of the Bay Area Public Health Departments focused on health issues.
Hi, I'm David Wolfering. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of San Bernardino.
I am Twinkle Parmar. I'm from San Jose State student.
Hi, I'm Garima. I'm also a graduate student in the Urban and Regional Planning program at San Jose State.
I'm Justin Gray. I work in the San Francisco HUD office in their Office of Public Housing.
Hi, I'm Sarah Johnson, and I'm also full-time.
I'm Gerard Witt, and I'm with Houston.
Hi, I'm Amy Davidson. I'm with the City of Berkeley, and I work in the Housing Department.
Hi, I'm Liz Derby. I'm with the Community Development Agency for the County of Berlin.
Hi, I'm Jessica Mendoza. I'm a reporter with the Christian Science Monitor.
Ben Arnoldy, a journalist with the Christian Science Monitor.
Bill Maher, SFO.
Patrick Calvin with the Bay Area Council Economic Institute.
Stephanie McNeil, Pike. I'm here to learn.
Jeff G., council member, City of Grove City.
Good afternoon. Camila Mena, Bay Area Council Economic Institute.
Matthew Hayes, Bay Area Council.
Hi, I'm Dave Boughton with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
Trevor Osler. I'm with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I'm in the Office of Public Housing.
Sir.
And I'm Joel Raimundo with the Bay Area Council, and welcome to our members watching us online.
All right, good. So Matt wrote some notes of things he wanted me to say. Are we on or off the record? This is nasty language I can't do in front of reporters.
You're online and on the record.
Okay. We're on the record. All right, I'll curtail my real thoughts. No. Thank you all for coming, and we have, it is a great crowd representing a lot of facets of life, all focused on an issue that we're spending an awful lot of time on for, I think, an awfully good reason. Big challenge. And the Bay Area Council, which has been around for 70 years, has been focused on housing because it's part of the, housing is such an important part of what creates the region and the quality of life in the region, that drives the economy of the region. And we're real proud of the economy that we have in this region. We've had a strong economy for generations, but we're challenged. The housing has been over time more and more of a challenge. I don't think it's ever been more so than it is now. I just came from speaking at a group, some of you may have heard of, called the Sacramento Seminar, which is mostly made up of folks who either served in Sacramento in the legislature, or people who worked around it. And I was talking about the Bay Area, and I spent probably half the meeting. I meant to talk about everything that we do at the Bay Area Council, and based on my comments and the questions that we received, I think I spent half to most of the time talking about housing issues. So people are really worried. They have some ideas. They're confused by what's going on, and so forth. So this is a really, it's a timely moment to have this conversation today, and we're looking forward to hearing from our speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then have a conversation moderated by our chair, Denise. And we really hope to get your input, because I know there's a lot of different perspectives in the room. The biggest contest, our speakers from Sacramento, and we've got students from San Jose State. So the big, if you want to have a bet, it's who gets home first. Transportation would sort of be the other thing, and they're related, of course. So we think that we've been talking about for years. Myself, I'm 12 years in the job. My predecessor, Sonny McPeak, who was a cabinet secretary after she left this job for Governor Schwarzenegger, was a Contra Costa County supervisor, very involved in the issues of housing, was saying a long time ago that this is a really bad creeping problem, and it has certainly creeped. So we think the imbalance that exists is as profound as it has ever been. Just an example is in 2013, San Francisco added almost 29,000 jobs and 120 housing units in the same year, 2013. So that's an awful imbalance, and speaks to, it's an anecdote, but it speaks to the kind of problem that we're having today. So clearly, we're pushing people into new ways of living, and those ways include people moving in together in relationships that probably aren't sustainable in the long term, in terms of creating what we would probably think of as family. They are moving to outward places, in some cases outer parts of the region, or parts out of the region, and forced into really unsatisfactory commutes, living in places that aren't really connected to the Bay Area, either at all or well, by the transportation system. So it means more car trips, more vehicle miles traveled, just the opposite of everything that we're trying to do through laws like AB 32 and SB 375, which were designed to reduce carbon production in our state. We're kind of going the opposite way because of our inability to kind of match up the housing supply with the economy and the demand for jobs. This affects everybody. No one's apart from this, because we're all feeling the pinch, but low-income people and families unquestionably feel this the worst. And without question, we're seeing skyrocketing rents, median houses, median home prices that are outside the affordability levels, for most people, and displacement, people who grew up in a community and no longer, given a circumstance, the sale of a building, fire, just other people coming in willing to pay more money, they're being forced out of the community that they grew up in, and that is a really profound and disturbing challenge. So, everybody is kind of threatened by this, and we think a lot about the economy. I was watching the debate last night, the Republican debate, and I was just kind of wondering how people in America can relate to the debate, because, as much as I feel a lot of challenges, and maybe you do, I think in the Bay Area, where we have an unemployment rate that's somewhere around 4%, and we have a lot of problems, and we see a lot of things, but basically life, people come here to ask how the life here is so good. How is it that we have such a good economy? 45% of the venture capital that's invested in America is invested in the Bay Area. So for all kinds of people, there's different ways to work and different places to live, and we got this incredible unwinter-like weather that, you know, may be bad for the drought, but, you know, it's nice to live in. But think about what's going on in other parts of the country, in vast parts of the country, and you can understand why Donald Trump's message is really hitting home with so many people, because so many people across the country are, you know, they're destitute, they're out of a job, you know, they're so underemployed, and they're so, you know, a week away from, you know, of being dispossessed of their home. I mean, that's kind of the story, and it's why I think people are so angry with their government, with Congress, with institutions that enables this conversation to take place that, you know, doesn't resound with us so much in the Bay Area, but is definitely resounding, you know, with people nationally. And so, you know, we have to remember that despite what we may think the challenges in the Bay Area overall, you know, we're still in somewhat of a bubble, but it's not for everybody. A lot of people right here in the Bay Area are really in trouble, and you know, the homeless population has risen. It's become more visible. You know, today in San Francisco, you know, we're seeing the affect of that. It's not a new issue. It's just kind of the latest story. So we as an organization, you know, we go back a long time. We're really interested in solving this problem. We realize it's probably not a one-size-fits-all set of solutions because, you know, there's so much that's happening, and there's people at the lunch ask me about, well, what about, you know, mini units of housing, or, you know, different, you know, manufactured housing, mobile housing, you know, all kinds of things that we really weren't looking at a few years ago, but that we're looking at today. At the White House, Jason Furman, who's President Obama's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, has spoken out a lot about something we've been talking about, which are the zoning laws. And we put in zoning laws in our cities. You know, the thought was to protect the quality of life and the culture of local areas, but what he's saying is, and what a lot of folks are saying these days, is this over-zoning, over-regulation of what can come in has really had a diseffect on the amount of housing that can be created, and it's significantly impacting our lowest income communities. They're the ones actually getting pushed out the most. So recently there was a report from our legislative analyst, our nonpartisan legislative analyst in Sacramento, which reflects, I think, this new wave of thinking. It's not really a new wave, because I think some folks have been saying it for a while, but it's putting some real numbers and examples and research to make the case that, you know, if we overzone and the result is that we're not producing enough housing overall, we're not going to succeed as a society, and the poorest among us are going to be the most disaffected in the process. So the report in 2015 came out. It's called California's High Housing Costs, Causes and Consequences, and explains the impacts of this, what we think is a overuse of the regulatory system that's emerged in California, what seemed to be for good purpose, probably well-intentioned, but definitely not working. And so the follow-up report to that was called Perspectives on Helping Low-Income Californians Afford Housing, and that's what we're here to focus in on today. And we have Brian Uhler. Third time to talk. Brian Uhler. He's the author of this report, so he's come to speak to us today about the research. He's going to take 20 or 25 minutes to, I think, take us through a discussion on this, and then after that, we really want to get your input. And Denise Pinkston from TMG, and who's co-chair of the Housing Committee of the Bay Area Council, is going to moderate this conversation. And again, you know, listen intently to this report, because we're really taken by this work. It's, you know, we think it's extremely meaningful and provides a path forward. And then we'll have a discussion about it. So, Brian, it's all yours.
Great.
And when we're done, we have wine and cheese, right? Is that right?
Over wine.
You have to answer questions. Pass it, please.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank the Bay Area Council for having me and giving me this opportunity to come and share our work with you. I think that you know, it's no surprise to anyone that California's housing is extremely expensive. Exceedingly expensive. In fact, many of California's coastal markets are just about some of the most expensive places on the planet. to buy housing or to rent housing. It hasn't always been this way in California. If you look back sort of to the middle of the 20th century, in the 1940s, California's home prices were only about 20% above the national average. But around the 1970s, there started to see significant divergence in housing costs in California from the rest of the nation. By 1980, housing costs were 80% above the national average, and today they're now 2.5 times the national average. And our office has been sort of looking at this issue for the better part of the last 2 years, looking basically into the questions of why is this so, and what are the effects of this trend. And I think that it's certainly a complicated issue. There's a lot of factors in play in terms of what is making housing so expensive in California. But first and foremost, and also probably the most straightforward, is that California simply has a significant housing shortage. In most of our coastal markets, the supply of housing has dropped significantly from where it was in the middle of the 20th century. And because of that, we're now seeing that housing supply is not nearly keeping up with demand. So just a few observations to sort of demonstrate this point. The first, we can see on this chart, and just, I guess, a few background information for those of you who, I guess, don't speak census geography fluently. We define California coast as essentially the state's 6 large coastal metros, which essentially include the San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, San Diego, LA, and Orange County. And those metro areas, just for the Bay Area ones to give you an idea, when I say San Francisco, that actually means San Francisco, San Mateo, and Marin counties. Oakland means Alameda and Contra Costa. And so you can see, just looking, comparing the coastal metros to themselves in the mid-20th century, between 1940 and 1970, these metros, housing in these metros grew by 200%. Over the period, the 1980s to 2010, housing grew by about 30%. And comparing that also to sort of the national average, the typical U.S. metro throughout the country grew by about 55%. For San Francisco, between 1980 and 2010, the pace of housing growth was only 18%. Housing units only grew by 18% over that period. And there was only a handful of major metros throughout the entire country that grew slower than San Francisco during that time. And most of those aren't places that you would generally associate with a booming economy. Generally, we're talking about Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, New Orleans, Cleveland, these types of places. Again, not really the kind of place that you would think of as a sort of a cohort with San Francisco. An additional observation that sort of points at the fact that there's something somewhat broken with the housing market in California's coastal metros. And when I say broken, I essentially mean, basic economics, basic common understanding suggests that when the price of something goes up, the people who are supplying that will respond by supplying more of it, building more housing. And in many parts of the country, we see that natural process occurring. But there seems to be something that's sort of blocking that from happening in the California coast. And this is one example. If you look during the mid-2000s housing boom, where prices were rising precipitously everywhere, including in the California coast and the Bay Area, the rest of California and the rest of the country, you see that builders in the rest of the country and the California inland areas responded by increasing building. On the coast, it was pretty much flat during the boom. Another example is just sort of taking a place that some might sort of consider as having a similar type of economy, similar type of draw in terms of demand to live there, which is Seattle, is sort of a good comparison place for the Bay Area metros. If you look over the last 3 decades, Seattle grew twice as fast as San Francisco, and San Jose about 1.5% compared to about 0.7% in the Bay Area. Now, there's a lot of factors sort of underlying this shortage of housing, but I think most of it comes back to fundamentally that the existing residents in many of these communities do not look upon new housing favorably for a variety of reasons. And over time, beginning around the 1970s, local institutions, local zoning codes, local laws, and state laws have been shaped sort of in the image of this resistance to housing, creating several roadblocks for new housing to be built. Just a couple of examples of sort of the manifestation of that resistance to housing in local laws. One review of zoning laws in California's coastal communities found that 2/3 of cities and counties along the California coast have enacted some type of formal growth control on housing. Looking at the amount of time that it takes for a builder to receive a permit or rezoning in the California coast, we also see that it takes significantly longer. One national survey showed that nationally the average city issued a permit in about 4.5 months. In many parts of the Bay Area, it's not uncommon to see jurisdictions reporting that it takes over a year. And similarly, the survey found that zoning takes several months more than the national average, rezonings take several months more than the national average in California's coastal communities than the nation as a whole. Another role where you see sort of some of the local resistance to housing playing out is at the ballot box. Our review of local elections between 1995 and 2011 found that California's coastal communities approved 5 measures a year that limited housing in some way, either by enacting a formal growth control or rejecting some project that had been approved by the council. And this is sort of an outsized amount of voter engagement in the planning process. If you look at one survey, found that of land use measures on local ballots, about 40% of those were in California, obviously disproportionate to both the number of governments we have in our population. State policies certainly sort of amplify this local dynamic. One that we have highlighted in particular is the state's environmental review policies under CEQA. And part of the issue comes back again to the issue of local groups being resistant to housing. CEQA, we've seen, can be used in some instances essentially as an additional tool to delay or to block or force the downzoning of housing projects, all of which can add time and cost to projects. Our analysis looking between 2004 and 2013 at housing projects in the state's largest cities found that those that required an EIR took 2.5 years to obtain approval. So a natural question then is, if we have a housing shortage, basically how big is the problem? And this is a very difficult question to answer. And lots of people have taken different looks at this issue. But I think that often this issue is framed in terms of looking either at comparing the amount of housing that's built to underlying population growth or growth in jobs. And we had some concern that those numbers might sort of not reflect the actual demand for housing in California. And in part, that's because it sort of it ignores an underlying trend of rising housing costs in California over the last 3 or 4 decades. And those housing costs were basically a signal that there is intense competition for housing. And part of that competition means that some folks are losing out, and when they lose out, that essentially means they go and live somewhere else. And so those people don't show up in our jobs numbers, they don't show up in population growth numbers. But nonetheless, their demand has contributed to the rising prices because they were part of that competition driving up the prices. So our analysis attempted to use basically price growth as a way of gauging essentially what is the demand to live in each of California's. We did it at a county level. And while we do report some sort of precise looking numbers for our large counties, I think I would want to underscore that this isn't something that can be done with great precision, but I think the major takeaway here is especially if you look at the Bay Area counties, our findings were that the amount of housing that would have been needed essentially is several orders of magnitude above what was provided, and also what might be suggested by the state, by the numbers that are part of the regional housing needs allocation process. Now, the second part of our analysis.
Can you just go back one slide?
Sure.
Could you clarify the numbers at the bottom? Is that per year, or is that by times 1,000, or what's the?
That is the, so, let me give a little bit more background, I guess, on the specific analysis that we did. We sort of looked back over this 30-year period, 1980 to 2010, and we asked the question, essentially, how much housing needed to have been built in these areas to keep price growth basically steady with the rest of the country. And so these numbers are the average annual amount that would have been necessary based on our estimates to maintain that type of price trajectory.
But this also, these aren't the regional housing needs numbers that are dictated by the state.
They're not.
Okay.
Right. And yeah, as I mentioned, and actually in many cases, well, at least for the coastal counties, in many cases they're larger than those numbers. One thing I didn't mention on this slide that is worth noting is that you'll see our estimates for the inland areas are actually lower than what actually occurred, and essentially what that's reflecting, and I'll show some more information on this in a minute, is that a lot of the folks who were part of the demand to live in the coastal counties have essentially been pushed inland to these metros who responded by building housing for them. Had some of that demand actually been satisfied on the coast, there probably would have been less need for building in the inland areas. The second part of our research has been looking at what are the consequences of the state's rising housing costs. And the consequences are many. I think they start with the simple fact that most Californians spend a greater share of their income on housing than residents living in just about any other metro in the rest of the country. But they don't stop there. We found connections with high housing costs and longer commutes, higher rates of folks living in crowded housing. And we also see some issues with differences in sort of intergenerational differences in housing costs, as well as impacts on migration patterns, especially for low-income households. So to look at some of those impacts, you can see here that in general we find that in California, households, basically for controlling for the type of household, you can see that households are about 4 times as likely to live in crowded housing in California than they are in the rest of the country. And crowded housing here defined essentially as more than one adult per room, not bedroom, but room, counting kitchens and living rooms, I guess, assuming that people could sleep in those places. Looking a bit at, as I mentioned, some of the intergenerational issues, we find that both homeownership has been falling among younger Californians, and housing costs paid by young Californians have been increasing. So if you look, for those born in 1960, 40% owned a home by the age of 30, compared to only 27% of those who were born in 1980. And similarly, we can see in this chart that while California's homeownership rate it's declined slightly, but it's been relatively steady, the homeownership rate among those who are 18 to 30 has dropped significantly from 25% in 1960 to 15% in 2013. Similarly, looking at differences in housing costs across age groups, we see that this is showing sort of the share of income that folks are spending on rents. We can see that has been growing for all California renters, but it appears that it has hit sort of younger renters harder. We can see a divergence starting again around the 1970s. This is sort of looking at the other effect I mentioned in terms of changing migration patterns. we see here that with an exception of Oakland, most of California's coastal metros added very few low-income households in recent years. Most of the in-migration to these places has been households making over $100,000 a year. And the flip side of this has been that many of those low-income households who aren't coming to the coast are going to inland California and other places. 4 in 10 of the low-income households who moved to California's inland metros in the last few years have been coming from California's high-cost metros. And this means that more people have been moving to California's inland metros from the coast than from any other location outside of the state. So all of these findings led our office to a recommendation, sort of a broad recommendation in our first report that suggested that state policymakers and local policymakers look for ways to encourage more private market rate housing development. And since then, we've sort of observed some of the public discussion around our report and around this idea, and have taken note of concerns that a policy that focuses on private market rate development may not provide benefits that essentially make their way down to the lowest income residents in California. And so we wanted to spend some more time looking into this question, looking into the various issues raised under this banner. And we started essentially with the question of California and local governments have a variety of existing programs that are intended to help low-income households afford housing. We have subsidized construction, we have vouchers, inclusionary housing, rent controls, various policies. And the first of our questions was essentially, is there really a need for market rate housing at all? Can this problem be solved simply by focusing more on those programs, providing more resources in those programs? And our findings were essentially that, practically speaking, we didn't think that that was probably a realistic alternative, focusing solely on those interventions. And the reasons sort of can be grouped into 3 major categories. The first is that in many cases doing so would be extremely expensive. So take, for example, our analysis looking at the cost that it would take to provide subsidized affordable housing, to construct subsidized affordable housing for all of California's low-income households. And the issue here is simply one of scale. California currently has a little over 3 million low-income households, and only about a quarter of them are currently served in some type of affordable housing program, either subsidized housing or receiving housing vouchers. That means that the majority of California's low-income households are receiving little or no assistance, and most of them, about 1.7 million, are spending more than half of their income each month on housing. So looking at that vast number and just looking at some of the data on sort of the basic average per unit cost that it takes to build an affordable housing unit for a low-income household, we estimated that it would require public outlays somewhere north of $250 billion to provide sufficient number of affordable subsidized units for all of California's low-income households. Now that could be spread out over several years, but it's still, we would be talking about something in the tens of billions of dollars a year in terms of public commitments. Similarly, in looking at the issue of expanding housing vouchers, we found, again, it's sort of a matter of scale. You have, again, well over 1.5 million low-income households who are in need of some assistance, and on average, they're paying their costs for rent is exceeding what is typically treated as the threshold for the amount that households in these programs should be spending, which is 30%. They're spending on average $7,500 more of their income over this threshold each year, suggesting that expanding vouchers to all these households would cost something in the neighborhood of $20 billion a year. Now, I think that simple calculation, there's good reason to think that might actually be understating the cost, simply because that if you were to expand the supply of vouchers to low-income households or to any Californians that broadly, you're very likely to have a significant response in terms of prices and rents, with prices and rents going up in response to this increase in sort of buying power of low-income households, which would be likely to increase sort of the cost that it would take to provide these vouchers. The second set of issues is essentially that the state's existing housing shortage poses some problems for sort of a major expansion of these types of programs. So again, as I mentioned, with housing vouchers, an issue here is that because of the housing shortage, simply increasing the buying power of households sort of just intensifies the competition for the limited resources. It doesn't help to really add more units to help ease that competition. And we see that that could backfire in terms of rising rents, but it also, there is some research suggesting that in tight housing markets, voucher recipients simply have a hard time finding any landlords who are willing to take their voucher. We see, even under current conditions, that in tight housing markets, some research suggests that only 2/3 of voucher recipients are able to use their voucher. And I think it stands to reason that if you were to significantly expand the supply of vouchers, that problem would be amplified. There's also just sort of a general problem with any sorts of interventions such as vouchers or rent control that aim to make housing more affordable without increasing supply, and that basically is that they're not addressing the underlying issue. And while these programs, especially in the case of rent control, may in some ways be effective in making housing more affordable for particular existing residents who are able to stay in their home for a long time, who don't have to move for their careers or other reasons, these programs don't provide for affordable housing for new entrants into housing markets. They don't provide for people who need to move around the state just because of work or other reasons. And all of these factors can have a depressing effect on local economies, essentially by sort of deterring the flow of workers into local economies and helping to sort of spur local productivity. One study from researchers at Berkeley and the University of Chicago suggested that looking over the last 50 years, due to local land use constraints on housing, that U.S. GDP growth has been about 13% lower than it would have been over the past 50 years if the country's most productive cities had land use regulations that were more consistent with those found in the nation as a whole. The third area of concern with expanding the existing programs essentially comes down to that many of the problems that are sort of forming constraints for private market rate development also apply to some affordable housing programs, particularly subsidized construction and inclusionary housing programs. Many of the sort of neighborhood resistance, environmental review issues also apply to projects that are building strictly affordable housing. And with inclusionary housing, essentially there's sort of an upper limit on the amount of units that can be achieved through an inclusionary housing program that's essentially set by how much private development you're having. And to the extent that other policies that are limiting the amount of private development you have are maintained in place, that creates sort of a strict limit on how effective inclusionary housing programs can be. So given that it doesn't appear that solely expanding existing programs could help achieve the goal of helping all of California's low-income households afford housing, we considered the alternative of whether or not these programs could be supplemented by looking at ways to encourage additional private market rate development. And we wanted to essentially look at, is this really a feasible way of creating any terms of relief for any relief for low-income households? We started sort of with the basic question of that looking into sort of the basic retort that new housing isn't built for low-income households. It's built essentially for more affluent households and therefore doesn't have any effect on the supply of housing at the lower end of the market. And I think that our work agrees sort of with the first part of that statement that a lot of new market rate housing is constructed for folks who are in the higher end of the income spectrum, but that does not necessarily mean that new housing does not have an impact on the supply of housing at the lower end of the market. The first part of these findings was basically documenting the fact that indeed depreciation of housing does exist, and even in California's most expensive coastal housing markets. You can see here in this chart that what we basically did is we looked at a cohort of housing that was built between 1980 and 85. We looked essentially at where in the rental distribution that housing was in 1985 when it was relatively new, and you can see that it was being rented to folks who were near the high end of the income distribution. But in just 25 years, it had fallen essentially to the middle of the housing market. Now, this process, while we do document it occurring in even our most expensive housing markets, it's important to note that this natural sort of depreciation process can be stunted by policies that restrict the amount of private construction. One study found that depreciation rates nationally are about 2.5% a year, but in tight housing markets are notably lower at less than 2% a year. The depreciation of housing is not the only way that additional market rate development can help add to the supply of housing at the lower end of the market. There's also the issue that the new market rate housing can help to relieve competition essentially between middle income households and lower income households. When new market rate housing is constructed, middle income households who are looking either to upgrade their housing situation may take advantage of that new market rate construction. Whereas if there isn't that new construction for those middle income households looking for new housing, they essentially may choose instead to stay in their existing housing to renovate it and to keep essentially this natural depreciation from occurring. Similarly, landlords have much more incentive to continue to maintain and renovate their property so that it can continue to be marketed at more affluent individuals instead of, again, allowing this natural depreciation that provides for more affordable housing at the lower end of the housing market.
Could you define middle income just for purposes of that statement there? Just give us an income level, household income.
It depends on the market. I mean, I don't think that.
But your suggestion was that housing is built for middle income. I'm just curious what that means in terms of spending power or something like that.
No, I guess it like I said again, it depends on middle income is defined, based on the location that you're talking about. So I don't think that I could give you a particular dollar amount. It depends on the region, and certainly, in some regions it may be
like maybe those two cities right there.
Sure. Right. Well, so in these areas, as I was going to say, that I sort of have simplified the dynamic sort of for purpose of demonstration, but essentially there's sort of in many cases, especially in these more expensive markets, this sort of filtering down process may actually have sort of multiple links in the chain. It may be that the new development in these very expensive markets is only open to maybe not even middle income households, but higher or upper middle or higher income households. But they're still nonetheless you can have sort of this similar type of effect where say a higher income household may move out of their existing house, move into the new construction. This then may open up a house for a middle income household to move up, and similarly then that house that the middle income household was living in would become available for a low income household. So it's certainly not there's not sort of a direct causality. There in some cases can be sort of multiple links in this chain. But as our sort of additional research that we did sort of does support the notion that this increase in supply at the lower end of the market does appear to be occurring. And sort of consistent with this is sort of looking at the growth in rents paid by low-income households in markets, two sets of markets that ostensibly have high amounts of housing demand. One is the California coast, and the second is sort of U.S. Urban U.S. counties where housing growth was the highest. Both of these places ostensibly had significant demand for housing. They responded in different ways. The California coast responded, as I mentioned earlier, by building a very limited amount of housing. These other counties responded by building high amounts of housing. And we find, particularly, I guess let me put some specific numbers on that, comparing the growth rates from California coast to this subset of U.S. counties with the highest amount of building. The California coastal urban counties grew only a third as fast as the fastest growing counties, and over the same time period, the rents paid by low-income households in the California coast grew 3 times as fast as rents paid by low-income households in the fastest growing counties. As a result, currently, if we look at sort of the share of income that's spent by low-income households in each of these groups, low-income households spend about 55% of their income on housing in the California coastal counties, compared to 43% in the fastest growing counties. And that difference of 10-11% of income, based on some research, is basically the amount of total spending that a typical low-income household spends on all transportation costs, just to sort of put that into context. So the final issue that we wanted to look into was sort of an additional concern that even if building additional market rate construction, market rate housing may help to reduce housing costs, there's still some potential that this housing could sort of hasten the displacement of low-income households from traditionally low-income neighborhoods. And so we attempted to sort of to test this idea using Bay Area census tracts over the last decade. And we essentially grouped these Bay Area census tracts into the ones that had the lowest fifth in the amount of housing construction that they had, and the ones that had the highest fifth in the amount of housing construction they had, and then compared a relatively simple measure of displacement between these two groups, and found that displacement occurred significantly less in tracts where housing construction was high as compared to where it was low. Now, I think a few important caveats with this. One is that our measure of displacement is looking broadly at the population of these census tracts. We're looking essentially at what was the change in the overall low-income population of each census tract. And if there was an overall decline in that population, then we defined it as experiencing displacement. Now, a couple of caveats, as I mentioned. One is that our findings certainly don't suggest that no individual, even in census tracts where we didn't define displacement as occurring, may be experiencing displacement. Change will occur with any amount of housing construction, and I think that as we're displaying here, even in the high development areas, we're not showing that there's zero amount of displacement, but we're showing that in general, overall, for taking low-income households as a group, it appears to be that you can reduce the amount of displacement they experience overall as a group by building more housing.
By how much? It's not clear how much that reduction is.
It's about 25 percentage points.
And this is all counties in the entire Bay Area, so Brentwood and West Oakland are sort of all averaged here.
That's correct. Well, we actually focused specifically on low-income census tracts, which are essentially defined as those with a median income that is above the regional average, or I'm sorry, where the proportion of low-income households that are defined as low-income is above the regional average, which is about 39%. I would add that yes, while this analysis that I'm showing here and that we reported in our report does include all the census tracts in the Bay Area, we did do some runs of our analysis that looked only at census tracts in the 3 center cities, Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose, and still found results with basically the same conclusion that in tracts, even just looking at in those center cities, the tracts with the highest amount of construction similarly had less displacement than the tracts with the lowest amount of housing construction.
Did you separate renters from first-time homeowners in this analysis or not? Because in 2008, there was quite a bit of displacement in all census tracts, but primarily in low-income first-time homebuyer tracts as a result of the financial crisis.
Right. No, we're not. We didn't separate. We did not distinguish between the displacement of low-income households based on whether they were renters or homeowners. We simply looked again at the low-income population in each census tract in totality, whether they were a renter and a homeowner, and again defined displacement as being sort of any negative change in that total low-income population.
And you seem to be suggesting, these data seem to suggest that there's, no difference between communities with inclusionary programs and those without.
Yeah, I think that that was the next point that I wanted to sort of clarify about our findings here, and to clarify essentially that the objective of this analysis was not to test whether or not inclusionary housing is an effective policy of preventing displacement. In fact, I don't think necessarily that this data speaks to that question. The question that we were considering in terms of breaking out these two groups was whether or not this first finding in terms of looking at all the communities, whether or not this effect was essentially being created by the fact that when in many of these communities, when you had additional market rate development, because of inclusionary housing policies, you were getting some affordable housing along with it. So what we essentially wanted to test was the effect that we were seeing being driven simply by the fact that those inclusionary housing policies existed and that this market rate housing was coming along with some affordable housing, or was it the market rate housing construction sort of in and of itself that appeared to be linked to these results? And so by breaking out communities that did not have inclusionary housing policies, as sort of defined, I think, by a survey that's administered by ABAG, we found that the results were similar in those communities, suggesting that this link is related to the market rate construction in and of itself, and not, again, due to the inclusionary housing policies. So I think a couple of sort of important concluding comments. One is that, I think maybe to go back to this slide, and looking just sort of at the sheer magnitude of what we were estimating it would take to make a serious dent in affordability, it's definitely important to acknowledge that what we're talking about is a significant shift from the status quo. It would require a significant shift in the way that localities in the state think about land use policy, in the way that we think about environmental review policies, and it would also take sort of a fundamental shift in the way that residents of these communities think about how growth should be incorporated within their communities. Just to sort of give an example, in our sort of hypothetical world here, where San Francisco was building an adequate amount of housing to keep up with its demand, under this scenario, its population would have been twice what it is today. Now, to put that in some perspective, we tried to look, I think it's often said that many folks are afraid that San Francisco may become Manhattanized. And we tried to sort of take a look at this and sort of look just sort of what would the overall housing density be in San Francisco if you had this much housing. And I think we found that San Francisco still is a quite a bit off from being sort of Manhattanized. Its density currently of housing is only about 1/4 of what's found in Manhattan. And even if it had built under our higher growth scenario, it still would have only had about half the density of Manhattan. Sort of put that into some context.
What's the population of Manhattan? It's 1.4 million. What's the population of San Francisco? Over 800,000. You double the population of San Francisco, you are well in excess of the residential population of Manhattan. Having lived in both cities regularly, I'm pretty clear on that. And the idea that you would say, would anyone, under any scenario, would more than double the number of units in San Francisco in 30 years without displacing existing units, just isn't real. The data isn't real. And I'm sympathetic to the cost.
Sure.
But real data is helpful.
Right. No, I think, and this is part of what I was trying to sort of, what I was trying to mention with our displacement analysis is that I don't think that it's possible that you can move to a world where you have an additional amount or a significant amount of private development, and that there will be no change occurring, that the urban form won't change, that some individuals may be displaced from their existing homes, potentially, depending on how policies deal with them, moved into some of the new housing that's constructed. But no, there is no way to move to this world without some changes in the existing urban form, some changes in the existing housing stock. I completely agree with you.
What happened in San Diego during this period? So there's a city where there's a pretty even match, based on your model, between what happened and what needed to have happened. What was the outcome? You know?
Yeah, so San Diego, what's being reflected here is that there, at least compared to the other coastal areas, their growth in housing costs was not nearly as steep. And I think part of what's driving that is the period that we're looking at. I think San Diego was was hit more than a lot of these other areas by some of sort of the federal downsizing in terms of military expenditures and other things in the 80s and 90s. And so I think some of that is reflected in sort of the economic growth and growth in housing costs in San Diego relative to the other.
And just to point out, you're talking counties, right?
That's right.
So does anybody know North San Diego County? You all know what happened in the 1980s and 90s? They literally built an entire world in Vista, California. So the other thing is the typologies here. You're talking about suburban growth at a county level compared to counties that are primarily urban, like a San Francisco or an Alameda. So isn't that a slight apple and orange?
Alameda is 90% suburban.
Okay, well let's take San Francisco. My point is you've got very, very different counties in terms of the land use pattern. San Diego County was a desert that was turned into suburban communities, for better or worse. So the opportunity to develop and the typology of development is very different. We're now in a smart growth world where most people wouldn't advocate for building Vista, California.
I was just going to say, we were moving into Q&A, which is great, and that's where we're going. But what I'd like to do is have Brian finish the slides and then do a summary and then open it up for what will be a very lively and informative discussion.
Thank you.
Right. Well, I guess I'll sort of answer your question. And then we'll get to the
Sorry
Q&A.
if you're from San Diego. I wasn't.
No. Yeah. Right. And I think sort of a few more again overarching caveats. And I think another is to say that we're not suggesting a world where this problem is addressed solely through sort of pro-market, solely with private market rate development. We still think and see that even in this world that there is an important role for the existing affordable housing programs. We think that largely, based on our work, that the best way to achieve greater affordability for California's population broadly and for the low-income population broadly is to increase market rate development. Now, there are certainly some subsets of California's low-income population that even with increased affordability will still face housing challenges. thinking about folks who are homeless, folks with behavioral and physical health issues. Those folks will still face barriers to housing that aren't necessarily associated with just paying for housing, and there will still be an important role for providing some housing and other types of assistance for those folks, as well as many of these affordable housing programs have objectives that go beyond making housing more affordable. They have objectives that are based on making local neighborhoods and communities more socioeconomically diverse. And certainly there's some room in these discussions for those considerations and what role existing programs could play in achieving that goal. So I think with that we can go to the Q&A.
Great, so just to wrap up and then open it up to questions. Every Bay Area city is in the midst of an extremely lively debate, which we're starting to get flavors of here. And it's often a debate between advocates of allowing more private market development to occur because of a belief that if you have more units, you will, at some point in time, those units will filter in the market and more people will have more housing options. That's one sort of polar end of the debate. And I think the other end of the debate is we don't want any more of that private market rate housing because market rate means it's only affordable to something close to the 1%. Because it costs so much to build it now and it takes so long to do it now that no one can actually afford market rate housing, or my family can't, my children can't, my employees can't. So the only housing we should allow to have built should be affordable housing with 40% on-site inclusionary, with high-end lieu fees and net zero energy. So we shouldn't have any housing at all unless it's exactly what we want. And I think what this information tells us is that the truth is out there, but the truth is more complicated than a soundbite. And unfortunately, when heat is entered into a debate and passion and people's lives are terribly disrupted, we tend to dumb down the conversation to sound bites and to a certain amount of urban legend. And I think what is helpful is that the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office has looked at 20, 30, 40 years of data throughout the state of California. And yes, we can parse and debate whether, bits of it are true, but I think overwhelmingly what is true, if you go back to the initial slides, is that coastal California has produced less housing for generations than any other part of the country that had any kind of job growth at all. And we track better with the Rust Belt in terms of our housing production per capita than we do with other high growth areas. And that's a fact, and it's indisputable. The other fact is that where are our people going? The people who can't afford to live here anymore. They're not going to some nirvana of low greenhouse gas consumption and high pedestrian growth infill communities, which is what our state policies say. Our state policies proudly tout to the world. And the irony that at the Global Climate Summit in Paris, our governor said, California's licked greenhouse gases.
Oh, right.
We have infill development nailed. Our state policies require it. We are building in. And there's a cognitive dissonance that we need to confront as housing advocates between what we say, which is we are growing in, we believe in infill, we believe in transit-oriented development, and the reality, which is we are pushing our kids, our teachers, our nurses, our middle-income families into the Central Valley, and those guys are the lucky ones. A lot of them are leaving the state, and a lot of companies will follow suit. So one of the roles of the Bay Area Council is to say the emperor has no clothes when the emperor does not. And I think in the housing debate, injecting facts and information so that we can understand why a nurse at Kaiser is driving 2 hours a day to get to her job. You have to sit with that fact and then pretend now you're on a zoning board and you have this many people in a room yelling at you about how we don't want that house in our neighborhood. We're not opposed to housing, we're not opposed to infill, but that building is really a problem. And then the density gets cut in half. And 5 years of process and a lot of public hearings and a CEQA lawsuit later, maybe you get a 100-unit project. Maybe like in Lafayette, your 250, 300-unit project gets whacked at Barton, and now it's single-family homes at Barton. That story happens every Tuesday night in every city in the 9-county Bay Area. So I think the conclusion from this is that we have what we have created. It's like the Pogo cartoon about the environment from a generation ago. You look around, it's like, I see the enemy, and the enemy is us. Generations of well-intentioned land use policy in the state of California have created a situation which has unintended outcomes. I'm an environmentalist. I never intended for nurses to have to drive 2 hours to work with the pollution footprint and building homes for them in California's green fields. That was not what I was trained to do when I went to planning school, but that's the outcome. And so I think we need to recognize that the outcome of our policies is bad for the economy. We're slowing U.S. GDP growth. We're harming the Bay Area economies. Our companies are leaving. We're harming our kids and our families and our employees. It's bad for equity and displacement. There's so much more displacement that occurs from not building housing than occurs from building a building in the Mission District or a building in Oakland. And yet to go to a hearing, you would think that that mixed-use building is the worst scourge on the planet for causing displacement. City councils throughout the Bay Area are talking about how it's new market rate housing that causes displacement, because I have a 400-page nexus study here that tells me that that new building causes displacement and I have to charge it a huge fee. We have made housing the enemy. And how on earth can we solve a housing problem if we can't build any more housing? So with that, by conclusion, I invite you to join one of the Bay Area Council's initiatives, which is to gently begin to peel the onion on the housing problem by encouraging invisible density in existing single-family neighborhoods, which make up 60–70% of the land area of many of our cities, by allowing and encouraging homeowners to have second units. Invite another family to live on their single-family property. And you don't have to rent it as an Airbnb, but you can still get a little income and make someone else's life a little better. So we're kicking off an ADU campaign to follow the leadership of many Bay Area cities. Some of them are in the room, Berkeley, Oakland, many cities in Marin County are embracing this as a tool to allow more families to live in our single-family neighborhoods. If there are 1.5 million single-family homes in the Bay Area, and 10% of them did this, that would be 150,000 units. And that's an achievable goal. Vancouver, Canada has done this. You can get a second unit on a building permit, over the counter, low fees. It's kind of a beautiful thing. 25% of their single-family home land now has second units, 10 years after they enacted the policy. So it's effective, it works, it's well accepted. Cities can do this easily without getting trounced at the next election. And we can make a small dent in a very big problem while we continue their next report. You think this report was hot. Wait till you get to the next one, which is what should we do? Can't wait to get that one myself. So, with that by way of conclusion and call to action, join us, be part of the solution, because we are all part of the problem. And let's now engage in a lively second part of it. Yes.
Hi, my name is Pilar, and I actually don't fall in the two different spectrums that you just described. I actually do believe that we need all sorts of housing in our communities, and that's the work that we do down in the South Bay. My question is actually to the point of data. I want to know Brian, were you able to quantify the number of units it would take in order for the filtering to happen so that levels of affordability were maintained? And the second part of my question is, I don't work in San Francisco, I work in Silicon Valley, where our perception of density is 3 stories, 4 stories. I'm lucky if I can get away with 4. So
San Francisco too.
Well, I can't speak for San Francisco, I can only speak for Santa Clara. So my question is, what is the number of units that we need to drop down the price without any of the policy interventions that you had kind of earlier spoken about? And given the political and the community reality for my communities, which are lower density, what does that mean in terms of how much land mass do we need to expand out to build the number of units that your data shows that we would need?
Yeah, I mean, I think one point, again, I don't want to dwell too much on the specifics of our estimates here. As I tried to suggest, these were sort of to give a sense of magnitude, and they were for something that probably is a very lofty goal, and that would have been for California's housing cost growth to be something more like the rest of the country. I think that in probably any realistic universe, that goal is not achievable. California is always going to be more expensive than elsewhere. The question is how much. I don't think that that us or anyone else can estimate with accuracy how many units does San Jose need to build so that there's enough filtering going on that housing becomes cheaper for low-income households. What I would say is what I think that our analysis suggests is that any amount more than what we're building now will provide some benefit to low-income households. I certainly want to be straightforward that many the benchmark again in many sort of affordable housing programs is that low-income households shouldn't be spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Right? I don't think, as I mentioned, even in the fastest growing cohort of counties that I showed the sort of the difference in growth in rents. In those places, low-income households are still spending over 40% of their income on housing. Now that's still a lot, but it's 10 percentage points less than what low-income households are spending on the California coast. So it's a matter of that basically we look at the existing interventions that we have, and we're not saying that there isn't a role for those programs, that we need to completely shift away from them. We're saying that in part the discussion has come maybe a little bit too focused on what can we do through these programs and not on this other avenue that we believe even by increasing housing instruction, obviously this may not be a practical reality. Increasing the amount of building in San Francisco 5 times over, it probably isn't going to happen in anyone's lifetime, right? But building even 50% more, 20%, that will have some impact on low-income households, many of which, for the foreseeable future, because of the practicalities and because of the costs of expanding these programs, many of which will continue to be outside of these sort of assistance programs and will continue to struggle with housing costs. And so by building any amount more of housing, you're providing even a marginal benefit to them.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious. I think one of the great scourges is something that Denise mentioned is this notion of the nexus study that says if you build market rate housing, you are causing an impact that requires the builder of that housing to then go and offset the need for affordable housing because you built market rate housing. And there are these companies that peddle that argument and cities that endorse it, and obviously affordable housing advocates that like the money, right? So there's a cycle there, but it seems to me that one of the great myths that you're puncturing is that basic premise that the act of building market rate housing causes a need for affordable. It's really the opposite. That the act of building market rate housing is actually relieving some of the pressure because it's creating stock, it's creating opportunity for everyone. And I'm just curious, it may be jumping the gun, and maybe this will be in your solutions report. But I'm just wondering if the LAO is looking at that notion out there, because I think that is a huge impediment to the affordability of housing today, is that the impact fees that get built onto a developer then make the project not pencil, and then they don't build at all. And so I just wonder if the LAO is looking at that little cycle.
Sure. I think I would say with regard to the nexuses, we are one source of information and opinions on this issue, and I think that we have outlined what we think is a reasonable argument that indeed, overall, in most cases, building more market rate housing is beneficial to low-income households in that particular area, in that community, in that region, really. I think that information has to be considered along with all of the other information and weighed for its value. I think that's a decision that local elected officials are going to have to make. I think we've put out our argument and our information, and our opinion is not the end-all, be-all. I think the decision makers will have to weigh the merit of this argument with all the others.
Yes.
So, I totally get the supply and demand, and when you've got less supply and there's greater demand, you've got prices that are going up, simple math. On the supply side, though, I'm wondering how much is actually being taken away due to second homeowners and perhaps people who are retiring from outside of California into the community? Because we sort of look at it like jobs, housing, and so how much, when you look at how much is really available to the working family given all the other competition for that stock? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is some information that suggests that probably since the mid-20th century, there's been sort of a trend with sort of rising affluence that especially older households, retired households, are moving more so to places that are warm, basically, California, Florida, and that yes, that is part of what's driving higher demand in California. That it's not all from people who are moving here to work, and that's part of the reason that simply looking at comparing sort of growth in jobs and growth in housing units doesn't capture the entirety of the picture in terms of how sort of out of balance supply and demand are. Part of it is because of sort of retirees moving in and also creating some demand. There also has been a recent trend in terms of the number of units that are being used or converted to vacation homes. That's something that our office and lots of other folks have looked into. I think it's an undeniable trend that there are more housing units that are being used in that way. And I think that we don't have any particular opinions about whether or not that's a good or bad thing. I think that that's something that has to be discussed at the community level, and I think it's a difficult discussion.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I understand that you are not positing that this is necessarily realistic. You're sort of going through some theoretical scenarios. But one thing I want to clarify, and then I have a couple questions, is you're not showing here that by building 15,000 units a year in San Francisco or 55,000 a year in LA, that housing prices would ultimately come down. They just would rise more slowly, correct?
That's right.
So I just want to make sure we're understanding that. So my first question is, in this sort of multiple links in the chain, sort of trickling, housing availability, at what point do we run the risk of folks just moving into deteriorated housing stock? I mean, how do we ensure that the filtering doesn't end up with substandard housing conditions, whether it's overcrowding or poor condition housing? And the second thing is, I wonder if you know what percentage of total housing costs are local land use controls. You have that just as a percentage compared to construction costs, land costs, soft costs, everything else. Because your report spends a lot of time suggesting that relief, if you will, from local land use controls could somehow change the game here. I'm curious on those two questions, the filtering implications, and also what are we really talking about in percentage of cost?
Sure. So I mean, I think on the filtering question, again, this gets to my point that we're not advocating for a world where we're simply looking to market solutions. There's still a role for some government programs, some potential government intervention, and you've highlighted one area where there are considerations to be had, local and state discussions to be had about to the extent that we're providing more of our affordable housing stock through natural depreciation. I think that is an area that needs to be considered if we move more towards this type of a world. That it needs to be looked at are, what is the implications for the type of housing that low-income households are living in. I'm sorry, remind me.
So, for example, the affordable housing world, folks may know about a year and a half ago, HCD and a number of state agencies released a report on the costs of affordable housing. Land use controls were seen to be about 5 to 7% of total development costs, not including land acquisition. So it's a fairly small percentage of the land. So I'm curious, in the private market world, which is a little different, what are these land use controls as a percentage of cost of development?
So I'm a developer, I'd like you to answer that too, but I think what happens is in an individual static pro forma, land use cost is how much did you pay your lawyer, how much did you pay for your, how much did you pay in fees. The real cost is not that. The real cost is that we can't build, even in many parts of the Bay Area today, because construction costs are so high that we can't rent the end product for enough money to cover our construction costs.
Yeah.
So we don't build for a long period of the cycle. And then we hit like the beautiful 5-year window where our rents have gone up 30% everywhere, and now we can build. What that does is it compresses construction into a small window in time, And it means there's a feast or famine cycle in every cycle. And because it takes deals 8 years to get done, from the twinkle in the developer's eye and a pro forma that works on paper to actually building the building and occupying it, there's a huge amount of risk premium that's built into the construction. So you have to make the market cycle, everybody's bunched, and it costs more to build when all the general contractors are doing 20 years worth of work in a 15-year window or 10-year, 5-year window. They have to build and size their company so that they're active for a short period of time, and then they can be dormant for a while. And that's what you have is the sort of feast or famine. So the combination of all of those things, the time delay, the fact that you have to time the market cycle exactly right, or the risk is too high, the fact that everyone's using the same 10 contractors in the same 5-year window, so we're all paying 15% more every year for construction costs alone. Those are the intangible parts of adding cost as a result of a regulatory regime that makes it very hard to have certainty and to get things done quickly. So, you know, it's sort of the old adage, developers like to know what the rules are. What that means is, if we know we can start a building now and deliver it in 24 months, get it approved, get it designed, get it built, get building permits, it costs us less to build that than a project that takes 8 years with a lot of uncertainty and litigation and a bunch of, you know, kind of options.
And that's why I asked if you could just put a number to that.
So, Peter, I could help answer that. So in 2005, Glaser, Kiyoko, and Sachs wrote an article, "Why is Manhattan so expensive in regulation and the rise in housing prices?" And I recommend that everyone read this. They estimate that San Francisco, that our land use ordinances add about 50% to the cost of housing here, which is, you know, insane and about the highest.
Yeah, and they've similarly, Glazer's followed that up with some other studies. I believe one's called Zoning Steep Cost or Zoning Steep Price, something like that, that has a similar type of analysis and includes several metropolitan areas. I think, you know, they have one method of trying to quantify that. You know, we've reviewed that. I think it seems like a reasonable way of trying to put a magnitude on it. But I think, to sort of follow up on some of Denise's comments, it's not just the higher construction costs leading to essentially some depression on supply that ultimately leads to prices being bid up. But there's also there's also an additional effect of zoning rules that's also suppressing supply, and that's that no matter at what cost, even if developers could make it pencil out, in much of the land area in many of these communities, it's simply disallowed to build any amount of housing, really, because of zoning codes that are essentially saying housing sort of needs to be within the character of the existing housing stock, which essentially puts a physical limit on how much housing can be built. The other point is that some of the sort of effects of zoning show up also not just purely in housing prices, but in land costs. When you have zoning rules that are setting aside large portions of land for commercial or industrial uses or for green space, you're compressing the land market for residential construction and increasing the cost of land. So even if you were to look at what is the market price of land, to some extent that price is being driven by what the local zoning policies are.
Yes.
Back in 2007, I was the first senior economist of the Office of Economic Analysis in San Francisco, and I was tasked with conducting a lot of studies about the impact of expanding the inclusionary affordable housing restrictions back then with Mr. McGoldrick and supervisor and whatnot. What you are suggesting is correct, and it's that it's not the accounting costs, but the opportunity costs of the zoning restrictions that are the vast majority of them. And even at simulated projects that I was looking at for what the impact would be to expand the inclusionary affordable housing back in 2007, I was looking at a premium on land costs of 25 to 35% on the price per square foot of land, just on the land effect on zoning. Not to say on the other issues that you mentioned that were very eloquently stated about affecting the construction cycle, which then has extraordinary impacts on wages, salaries, benefits of workers who are nailing wood and putting foundations and all that. A lot of people who are the people who need the affordable housing, the workers, the guys who are getting dirty and building the foundation. So it's quite a substantial impact on the construction and development costs. It's not just like a 7% that would be pie in the sky.
Here and then in the back.
I had a question. I'd love to get back to this question that you raised earlier about the nexus studies. So, are you afraid of political pushback if the state tries to more forcefully challenge this analytic nonsense? Right, like the history of nexus studies are that they're in response to a court order in order for localities to show some type of connection between policies they already had, inclusionary zoning or in fees, and what that they had to show the connection between the new development and that. If you read these studies, the methodology assumes that housing demand at the low end is totally endogenous to housing creation at the high end. I mean, analytically, it makes no sense. And what I think your LA report is excellent, by the way, but it also agrees with literally the entire economic literature on this issue. Whether we're talking about Placer, Moretti, Kyoko, Quigley, Raphael, I mean, everyone agrees with your basic point here, and there's no support for this nexus theory. So why not push back more?
Well, I mean, I guess in a way, as I said earlier, I think that our intent was not to sort of launch a frontal assault on these types of nexus studies. But I think that we've put out the types of information that we believe could be used by local elected officials to sort of question some of the assumptions that are in some of those studies. Now, I think also that you had mentioned something about sort of political pushback in terms of questioning these nexus studies. And I think that it is important to acknowledge sort of the difficult situation and the pressures that that lead to some of these nexus studies and impact fees and other types of local revenue measures. And I think it's important to acknowledge that revenue raising ability of California's local communities is pretty constrained. Development fees are one of the few revenue sources that they have that don't require going to the voters. And so, in a way, it's understandable that communities have been looking this direction for additional revenue to fund all kinds of things. And that part of the discussion at the state level, when we're talking about what types of solutions the state might enact in order to encourage encourage locals or sort of push locals towards allowing more housing, we'll have to give some consideration to this dynamic of local finances. We're going to have to look at does it really pencil out for some of these communities to approve housing, or do we need to look at the underlying revenue structures going to local communities to look at how revenues are allocated amongst local communities? Do we need to shift, for example, the offsided, the way that sales taxes are allocated among cities? Do we need to, look back at the allocation of property taxes? I think all of these things will have to be important considerations.
I saw another hand, but I can't remember where it was now. Yes, in that, thank you.
Yeah, a couple questions. One, we're really concerned about some of the data that is not consistent with state data on affordable housing costs. So what you have is per unit state investment costs in affordable housing that's 136% higher than the state housing department's numbers. And also, according to data from the Treasurer's Office, your low-income housing tax credit program underestimated by half the number of affordable housing units built per year. So we're concerned that the data is really off, and we don't quite understand why. And the other question that follows up on that is that, as you yourself said, market rate development will never serve the needs of people at the lowest end of the income spectrum and those of highest needs. And so there is a need for investment in affordable development where the market doesn't ever function. So this report, though, in contrast, actually disparages programs that provide housing subsidies in favor of the market rate solutions. And we're concerned about why this report spends so much time attacking the benefits of investing in affordable housing, particularly at a time where there is so much pain.
Sure. I just wanted to write down all the questions so that I didn't have another moment where I didn't answer them. So first on sort of the average cost of the units, I think that the data that we use to calculate the 165 number is publicly available. It's on the Treasurer's website. The database is, it's essentially they maintain a database of all active low-income housing tax credit programs. And what we did was we went into that database, we looked at all of the projects that received funding over the last 10 years. We tallied the number of low-income units included in those projects, and then tallied the number of credits received by those projects, and divided those two numbers, and that's where we came up with the average. In terms of, I think that that you mentioned, it's there's one point where we quote that the low-income housing tax credit program provides for the new construction of about 7,000 units a year. Is that one of the numbers that you were questioning? Yeah, so the low-income housing tax credit program does provide funding for additional projects beyond that 7,000, but those projects are not new construction. They are rehabilitation, and in many cases, those projects are essentially providing additional cash flow to projects that originally started off as low-income housing tax credit programs as new construction, providing additional subsidy to help fund maintenance and operation of those, and in that way aren't necessarily sort of adding to the housing stock. So on that point, the 7,000 number is the number based on the data that I mentioned in that the data that's on the Treasurer's website of the number of new units that are funded through the low-income housing tax credit program. And then I think on your broader point about whether or not we're sort of disparaging existing affordable housing programs, I don't think, as I've said, that wasn't our goal. We're not advocating for a world where there's no role for these programs. I think all that we're trying to point out is that we feel that sort of the focus of some of the conversations, both state and locally, may have become sort of too focused on what can be achieved through those programs. And I think that we're suggesting that just given the scale of the number of low-income households in need of assistance, that practically speaking, focusing solely on existing affordable housing programs will leave many low-income households without assistance, and that by looking at ways to supplement these programs with additional market rate development is a way to help ease the housing costs for those low-income households who inevitably will not be able to receive assistance through the programs that are in place.
I want to clarify too on behalf of the Bay Area Council. I know Pilar mentioned that it sounded like somehow we were not in favor of nonprofit housing or assisted housing, and I clearly misspoke, because when I talk about the housing problem being like an onion with many layers, it also is going to have many solutions. And among those is a much more robust funding stream to provide reliable billions of dollars to the nonprofit housing industry in California to replace what was lost when redevelopment was eliminated. The Bay Area Council was very active in trying to keep redevelopment alive, largely because we knew that if it was eliminated, the entire ability of the state's nonprofit housing builders who build for the most vulnerable populations would be seriously compromised. And many of those organizations might even be forced out of existence, which would be a tremendous institutional loss to the state. Those are people who do what private developers can't and won't do. And they are an absolutely essential part of solving the housing problem. And what I meant to say is that they are cannot be the only solution. We cannot use subsidy to provide to nonprofits to do nonprofit building for low-income housing at enough scale to solve the housing problem at the level that we're at. And we need to look at other aspects of state and local policy, including zoning policy, tax policy, why cities don't value housing as a land use, why they prefer to have an auto mall. We need to really unravel all of these issues, because even if there were more money for housing nonprofits face the same challenges as private developers. They can't buy sites, they're too expensive. Land has become unaffordable because there's so much demand for housing that the land is worth more money than we can afford to pay, build, and deliver product to the people who need it. even if you get land, you can't get it entitled, or you can't get it entitled in a timely way, or you can't get it entitled quickly and get through secret without litigation. So the entire building community faces the same challenges, and a housing solution needs to focus on all aspects of the problem. So that would be a more complete answer, and I apologize.
Can I add to that as well, Denise? We supported, the Bay Area Council supported Speaker Atkins's bill last year for increasing funding for affordable housing, and Assemblymember Chu's bill as well. And even prior to that, we were very active working with then Senator DeSaulnier on his first iteration of that bill. So we've been as supportive as we possibly can be for affordable housing programs. But as Denise said, there isn't enough money in the state exchequer to subsidize the need that Brian has outlined, that for every single family that needs assistance, we're looking at $250 billion. That's double the state budget for affordable housing. It's just not there, so we need to look at alternative delivery.
Can I quickly acknowledge what Denise said? Because I want to take a moment here, because I actually think that there's an opportunity here. So clearly the Bay Area Council and your members know the for-profit, the market rate sector well. And then there's a whole segment of professionals that know the nonprofit sector well and the challenges that that we are all facing collectively. I mean, Matt and I have had many of these conversations. So I guess what I would say is that it's refreshing to hear what you just said, and it's refreshing to hear your clarification that the intent was not to disparage, because frankly, that's what it looked like to us. So now I'm thinking that when it comes time to do your third report, or as you're working towards your third report, my suggestion would be that your guys's and your expertise work on what you know best, but then reach out to the rest of us that know what we do best. And then let's figure out, so Matt and I have been talking about this for a long time, is there a way for the development community as a whole to have a platform? And I don't know what that looks like. I don't think we'll ever agree on everything, but I think that there are things that we can agree on.
They did it in Seattle. And Brian referred to what's taking place in Seattle in terms of the housing growth. And Seattle's economy is an economy that looks a lot like the Bay Area's economy, and it's a very highly educated workforce, but an old industrial economy. They've got a mix, and so if you go, how many of you have been to Seattle lately? So if you haven't, it's worth the visit just to get the feel of the place. And we took a group a couple of months ago to really check this out. And just as you said, what happened in Seattle is maybe what could be taking place in this room is that everybody got together. Mayor Murray really helped us along by sort of pushing everybody together and said, look, there's a lot of different things that need to take place. We need to create more housing. It needs to be affordable for the people who aren't going to be met by the needs of for the at-market housing that's going to be built. So how do we figure out a way to all really work together and enable Seattle to be competitive and not suffer displacement and not have rents rise to a point where the economy could be impacted? And I think it's a really great model. And they upzoned places that could be upzoned. They were very thoughtful about it. They created the affordability rates that were negotiated, and I think probably logical, and weren't one size fits all, depending on where you were and where in the market you were and so forth. And they hammered it out, and he basically, what we're told was, said nobody leaves this room until we figure this out. It took place over a period of time. But I think that's the opportunity that we'd like to explore. I'm on the board of Bridge Housing, which the Bay Area Council created. So the organization has a long history of supporting and innovating in the field of affordable housing. There's no issue around that whatsoever. What I think the study is showing is that if we really want to address the problem, we're going to have to take a look at that initial slide that says that San Francisco's housing production looks a lot like Cleveland and Detroit and cities that don't have any relation to what's happened in the economy of this city over the last period of time. And I would argue, look, we own this place. A lot of us were born here. Probably most of us moved here from some other place, because you were going to ask, that's what it shows. And because we love it, and it's such a special place. We didn't create this problem overnight. This study shows what took place over, a couple of generations. So, if we start building at, market rate housing, it's not like, voila, we got this thing solved. We need to begin, catching up, for a long period of where we were behind. When the Beacons came here in the 1950s, one of the great things about San Francisco was the cheap rent. But, that sounds like a joke, but that's the way it was. They came here because we built a lot of housing in San Francisco back in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. We stopped doing it around the 1970s. This sharp drop-off took place, and now we're really feeling the pinch. So, there is no one solution to this. It's going to take innovation. It's going to take, I think, a lot of really effective advocacy on the part of all of us to make it clear to the state that, there are certain parts of the state that are really, these coastal zones have been really disaffected by policy, and we need supports, we need subsidy, we need to understand better this effect of local zoning and get our cities on board the theory that, regulating so deeply what can be built is not helping, but it's, probably hindering. So,
and I want to say
I want to
thank you for
respect
that
it.
acknowledgement. And anyone in this room who would like to work with the Bay Area Council on housing policy issues, I'm a big fan of giving the whole choir the same piece of sheet music. And I think what's been happening in the housing debate is that we all were working in our silo, doing what we do best, as you very clearly said. And until the crisis reached this proportion, that worked. And I think we're now in a place where the crisis requires new solutions. We have to change the rules, and we need to change how we work together. And I would be very happy to work with you guys on funding for nonprofit housing, on a regional housing bond, on other ideas that have come forward, so that we can really make a dent on a lot of issues. The reason we chose second units as a place to start is because we viewed it as sort of low-hanging fruit that requires no subsidy. It doesn't compete with state dollars that go to nonprofits, and yet it could produce, 100,000 units. So if you can kind of get that done and put it aside and go back to the bigger issues, that was our thinking. But we can certainly do more than one thing at a time. And we would like to reach out to you as well and start working in partnership. And you've been raising your hand for a long time. So.
I sure have. Donald Joseph here, my housing advocate. And first of all, thank you so much for this report. Thank you for based on the federal data. And it's very interesting, and it really just shows us a slice of time that an opportunity that we could take here and fix our housing crisis here in the Bay Area. I'm personally from Seattle, and I learned a lot up there. I've been here for 3 years. It's pretty amazing. So I just want to correct the gentleman over here that mentioned about the foreclosure crisis and displacement. I want to remind the audience that with this foreclosed homes, the owners of the mortgage payers of those homes were allowed to stay in those homes for a good 12 to 18 months. There was no immediate displacement. It was very staggered, and it took about 4 years to get through that whole process of the foreclosure process between the banks and the mortgage owners. So I just want to remind everyone of that.
Thank you. Few other comments, and then when did we wrap up at 4:30?
15 minutes ago.
Oh, sorry.
No, we have another.
Will we continue to stick around and have this conversation, or people can break up since there are a few more questions? Why don't we go ahead and have those? Yeah.
I wanted to get some clarification on Seattle, because I was just up there 2 weekends ago, and I was talking to various people who live there, who moved there from San Francisco, who are realtors, and also there are cranes everywhere. So they're building all over downtown, but the prices are increasing. I talked to people who live there who said that their rents have doubled, that they don't have rent control on where they are. And then looking at a house, 2,300 square foot house, 800,000, 900,000. So this does not seem like a model that is better than ours. It seems like they're just a little bit behind the inflation that we have here. And maybe I'm missing something?
So maybe because you're from Seattle, I understand the rents are still way, way below.
Yeah, Seattle rents went flat. They had a building boom and they stopped increasing. And so you probably do know people whose rents went up, and that's what caused all that building to happen. Nobody just builds just because.
John Ram, the city's planning director, who moved here from Seattle, and he was the director up there, is fond of speaking in front of audiences and saying that Seattle and San Francisco, two roughly comparable cities, same rough geography, economic base, and all of that, roughly comparable populations, decade after decade, Seattle has built double the amount of housing that San Francisco has. So yes, they're screaming about housing prices, but about 60% of the price that we pay here.
Exactly. The other thing, sometimes I feel like we miss the point if we talk about prices, because the problem with prices is you can't see what would have happened had Seattle had more restrictive land use policies. You know, they had whatever unrestricted level that they had. If it had been more, I think their costs would have gone up. We just can't see it. But what we can see is the difference in how many humans get to live there. And so, I mean, that is something that you can count. Like if they had less zoning, you know, if the buildings that exist now had been illegal, and then the people there wouldn't have been able to live there. So if you count, if the reason why affordability is a problem is because it's when people can't afford to live somewhere, they don't live there, they live somewhere else, you know, like, so it's a matter of how did your population change? Like, did their population go up? Did they build things? Did they fill up? All those humans living there, that's where you know.
And what kind of place is it? And, you know, you look at Seattle, it's not just that there's more people or they build houses. No, it's green. They're doing all, they're doing, I hate Seattle. They're doing I don't like anything about it. Well, I don't like it.
Just to, I mean, it's a great Pollyanna thing, but, I mean, there's displacement in Seattle, there's gentrification in Seattle, they're struggling with a lot of the same social problems and the lack of diversity and the changing demographic. I mean, there's a lot of things that are also happening here.
And this report focused on the state. I was just going to say, it's very hard right now to hold out any one region as the best example of how to do everything.
Correct.
So I want to, although Seattle has some interesting lessons, and then Tim will get to you. What's happening nationwide is there's a housing crisis nationwide in cities that have job growth. So it's not just California. It's that California is building less housing, therefore the crisis is worse. I think that's true. If you look at New York or Boston, or just read headlines, every major metropolitan area with a lot of job growth has had a housing crisis because there, and frankly, are more people who want to live in urban areas, I think, generationally than there have been. So there's somewhat more demand to live in cities, at least at this moment in time. And where the relief valve for that, for my parents' generation, to a certain extent for my generation, was suburban sprawl. That's how we relieved the pressure on cities. Today, our policies are saying fill in. And we're trying to eliminate that suburban sprawl relief valve because we have greenhouse gas control policies that say we don't want to build that way anymore. It's not good for the planet, which forces people on top of each other, which means there's more controversy, more debate, more heat, more difficulty doing, and it's more expensive. So it's a complicated problem, and I don't want this to be a San Francisco versus Seattle debate, but I think we have a lot of room for improvement. And whatever incremental improvement we have will help the life of someone who right now can't afford or can't easily live here anymore. And I think that's the goal of these housing discussions, is to make people's lives a little better, a little easier, consistent with our philosophy that people should be living in infill locations, and we shouldn't be adding our population growth in California by plowing under farmland in the Central Valley. Tim.
I just wanted to go back to something earlier that our speaker raised about the idea of fees and costs, and you know how cities need revenue and they have limited ways they can do it. But I had to do a quick survey recently of finding out what the fee and exaction load on housing in San Francisco was. I just wanted to share it. It was among our members. It was 6 recent projects delivered across a variety of product types, type 1, type 3, type 5, and the total city fee and exaction load per door across these is sort of grouped fairly closely, and it runs about $100,000 to about $138,000 per door. That's the fee load that we're paying. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah, and if you add to that structured parking at $50,000 a door, you got $150,000 in costs before you even build a house. So, and that's part of the problem.
About 65% of that was inclusionary. So it's a policy debate worth having, for sure.
Other questions? In that case, I'd like us, before everyone dribbles out of the room, to thank thank all of you for coming and being engaged, and I encourage you to continue to reach out to the Bay Area Council with your ideas and suggestions so we can work better with you as your partner. Thanks for coming.
Excuse me, is this going to be posted online? Yes. Okay, we're going to hit, what is the website, just the city? No, we're going to have, we'll have it on the YouTube channel. So we're posting it probably next few days. So next few days? Yeah, we just type in the Bay Area Council for on search, and then we have to see a Bay Area Council. Okay.